now recording. Okay, so let me share the screen. Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna. All right, so this week, so far, we've covered basically 1/3 of the class. We had the exam on Tuesday. You can look probably for grades sometime during the weekend for that. And then today we are covering this topic, account management, Linux account management, which is pretty important. And that is really the process of creating accounts and just exploring that in general as it relates to the Linux operating system. So we will, if I click on this module, you can see here, I have a couple of slides. I will go over those on Monday, just, during the lecture part. And today I'm just gonna go over this a little bit on the virtual machine. So basically for this week, there's a couple of things. There's account management. There's also a Wireshark reading, slow network. Okay, so you can see here, just like all the other ones, right? You'll open the document and provide a one-page summary of fighting a slow network, right? So this will be the same approach. You load some PCAP files, open them in Wireshark, and then just go through the reading assignment. So it should be pretty straightforward. Let me go back to the contents here. And I'll actually create then the link for this the assignment. So this will be due 1 week from today. I've also graded a lot of your homework, so check your grades if you haven't done so already. So Wireshark. Slow network. Okay, so this will be due a week from today on the 24th, 10 p.m. And it'll close on the 26th Saturday. Just complete the attached Wireshark reading. Okay, remember I go not by numbers, but by names of homework assignments. Otherwise, I have no idea when I'm looking at lab 4, lab 5, what it is. All right, so complete the attached Wireshark reading. All right, so that should be clear enough for that assignment. So that should be pretty simple. All right, so I'm going to go over then, as I said, then the topic is Linux. There won't be much scripting in this assignment. There's only one Python script. So I'm going to minimize this. Next week, we will cover, or after Wireshark Slow Network or in account management, we'll cover DNS. This is a much more involved lab. So it'll I should say this will probably require you to have at least 2 VMs. So I would recommend that just as part of your work this week, try to create another copy of the seed VM. That's probably the best thing that you can do in your environment so that you can have 2 VMs. Make sure that when you create the 2 VMs that you can ping from one to the other. Okay, so that should be, yeah, great. So clone them, but just have 2 VMs. They should have 2 different MAC addresses, and they can be on the same network. And they'll have different IP addresses. So just test them that you can ping. Should be an interesting lab. One of the machines will have to interact with the other. So make sure that they are pingable, and just make sure that's part of your kind of work that you do this week. So you have that available for when we start. We may start next Thursday on that. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at today's topic. So as I said, we have a couple of PowerPoint presentations. I'll do those on Tuesday. Today, since it's lab, we'll go over the document itself that I posted. So basically here, as part of system administration in Linux, you guys are familiar with a lot of tasks that we do. And a lot of the tasks as it relates to access control are governed by users, user ownership of a file, right? So in this case, this is usually referred to as user account management, but it's basically the broader topic is called namespaces. And namespaces just means everything that's kind of a list of entities or a list of things basically in your IT environment, right? In your department, in your organization. And so namespaces can be, printers, can be email addresses, can be, and then obviously the space of user accounts is also part of that. Okay, so the main theme as usual will be for user account management will be, automation of some way. So you'll see that I'll present a simple problem. There's only one problem really, but it's a problem related to user account management. So let's go over the document here that I posted. This is the document that you will complete as part of your homework assignment. Should be pretty straightforward. So Ubuntu developers have made a conscientious decision to disable the administrative root account. So believe it or not, the root account is disabled, right, in your Linux operating system. And really the idea for that is it's auditing, really. So they don't want several people using the same root account and then you don't know who actually did what. So instead, that's why you have what is called a Pseudoers group. And then you can add different accounts like, John Smith, Mary Ronson, whatever, and you can add them into that Pseudoers group. And then basically they have now the root privilege. The advantage of that scheme is that they can do what root can do, but also you can track them. You know that it was Mary, or that it was John or David or whatever that actually did the work. Okay, so that's the philosophy, if you will, in Unix operating system. So by default, the root account, there is a root account, but it's disabled. And really, it would be recommended to just keep it that way. So this does not mean that the root account has been deleted or that if it may not be accessed. You can, in fact, use it. It merely has been given a password which matches no possible encrypted value. Therefore, you may not log in directly by itself. Okay, but you have to enable in order to use it. Enable it in order to use it. So instead, users are encouraged to make use of a tool, the sudo tool, right? So you guys probably have been typing that sudo a lot. I would recommend, actually, if you remember from the beginning, don't overdo it with sudo. Only use sudo when you're absolutely sure that you need it. Okay, because actually, whenever you're doing things with sudo, sometimes you're locking files under a root account, etc., and that may not be recommended. So sudo, as you know, allows an authorized user to temporarily elevate their privileges using their own password, instead of having to know the password belonging to the root account or having to enable it. You practice doing this all semester because you basically, have had to type sudo sometimes, especially when you install software, etc. This simple yet effective methodology provides accountability for all user actions and gives the administrator granular control over which actions a user can perform with set privileges. So as you will see, one important thing about the lab today is that you will see that you can actually, you can have accounts that have certain permissions, but then put those accounts in specific lists, and then those lists could be used to restrict the users from specific services. So that's one of the things that you're going to be testing out in your lab this week. If for some reason you wish to enable the root account, simply give it a password. So you can do something like this, sudo passwd, right? And sudo will prompt you for your password and then ask you to supply a new password for root as shown below. So you can see that. Okay. Yeah. So you'll play with this approach today. We've been using we've been talking about passwd a lot this semester, and it's just, it's really important, right? So you guys should certainly understand that it's important. Okay, to disable the root account, use the following command. So you can just type this command. By default, the initial user created by the Ubuntu installer is a member of the group admin, which is added to the Pseudoers file as an authorized pseudo user. If you wish to give any other account full root access through sudo, simply add them to the admin group, Pseudoers. Okay, and this lab will basically go over some of those features as well. So for instance, one section here is adding and deleting users. All right, so this will be the process of managing local users and groups, which is straightforward and and can differ very little from most other Linux operating systems. Okay, so in our case, we are using Ubuntu. So actually, I suggest that you play with add user or user add. You'll see that there's actually two commands that one is called user add, one word, and then one is called add user. So there are different implementations of this, and be aware that some can have slightly different behavior than the other. So when you're running through your lab, I would recommend that you practice with both. So here is basically what you have to do for the lab. So you're going to add a user. So sudo add user and then come up with some username. You can then delete the user and just practice doing that. Okay. Now keep in mind that when you create a user, you actually create a home folder, but then when you delete a user, that does not remove their respective all right. So remember that this does not remove the respective home folder. Okay. So you'll have to then delete the folder manually or archive it. So here's also an example of the process, right? So you're going to create a dummy account so that you can delete it basically. So you can call it dummy1. So then, do ls-l, go to the home directory, of course, first to see that the folder will not exist. Then you'll create the account, then you're going to delete it, but the folder will still be there. So now if you want to get rid of that folder, you can follow these instructions, which you can see here. First, you're going to change ownership to root. So this is basically a way of like blocking it so that now only root can access it. Then you're going to create a directory called archive users, and then you just move that user's folder that's already locked into that archive users folder. Does that make sense, guys? Are there any questions about that? Okay, good. All right. Now, you can also temporarily lock or unlock a user account. So you'll follow the following syntax. So sudo passwd-l username, right? And then you can try to log into that account, right? Now imagine that you can create a group, right? And then this is the command for creating a group, and then one for deleting a group. And then finally, once you have a group, then you can add a user into that group by just doing sudo add user username group. Right? So imagine, for instance, that you created an account called dummy1, and then you have a group called, chemistry, and then you want to add dummy1 to the group chemistry. Then this is basically the sequence for that. Okay. All right. Another thing that's very useful is that sometimes, let's say that you're going to create you have different departments, right? You have like the research department, and then you have like the marketing department, and you're going to create a whole bunch of accounts for marketing and a whole bunch of accounts for research. So you kind of have to decide, the permissions that they should have. Marketing may not need to have certain permissions that research and development probably needs to have of like configuring machines and adding software, etc. And so what needs to happen there is that instead of you going into every single account manually and changing it, etc., you can find something called a user profile, a security profile. So you go to that profile, right, before, and you make modifications to that profile. And then when you're creating accounts, now you're going to create them with that profile. Therefore, all of them are going to have similar access control, basically. And that will, result in more efficiency, basically. So you do that for research and development, then you change the profile for the people in marketing, and then you do the process like that. So that's a nice automation. You can read through this sequence of steps here, which will kind of illustrate how to do that. And it's not very complex. It's just a few commands here and there. Okay, it talks a little bit about chmod, and just notice that you'll be changing the chmod as a variable here to be able to accomplish that task. So here in this example, you're just going to practice doing that. Any questions on any of that so far? Any questions? All right, so once we have the user profile set up, we look at groups. So some groups allow, so the groups is also pretty important. Some groups allow access to files or directories. So for example, the ADM group allows users to read files in the var log folder. But some groups allow access to certain devices. For example, the dial-out group allows access to serial ports via the dev. So in this case, just try to read the file var log syslog with user and with the account you created, and see if you can notice a difference. Okay, so basically the idea is, remember now here, I should say, when I say user here, this is the user of the current VM that you're using. So in this case, it would actually be C. Okay, be aware of that. Just remember, just pay attention to what you're doing. The context is you're testing for this link, you're testing whether different users have different permissions, right? So a specific user may have access to something that other users may not have access to. The Pseudoers group, obviously that's a pretty important one because these are the administrators of the machine. This is how you keep track of administration. Okay, so basically go into that full, this is a group, go in there, take a look at it. And you'll see basically in there how accounts can be added, etc. Now, once that's basically all kind of just like exploration, trying commands out on the terminal. It should not be very difficult. The first problem, if you will, that you kind of have to work through would be really this one: restrict service to a specific account. Okay, so the idea here is you're going to restrict SSH access to only user accounts that should have it. So for example, you may create a group called deny SSH and add the group name as the value associated with the deny group's variable located in the file etc ssh and then the config file. So the idea is that every service, basically, because we know that in Unix, everything is pretty much a file, right? And so in Unix, this file would contain information about who is allowed to use SSH and who is not allowed to use SSH. So in this case, in the deny groups parameter in that file, you can add individual accounts. So you could for instance, create dummy one as an account, try to SSH into the machine with that account, and then you should be able to do it. But then once you go into the configuration file of SSH, you look for the deny groups parameter, and then now you will add dummy1, and now it should not work. Okay, so basically, you can, here it says add the value, deny groups, deny SSH. So that's it. That should take care of it for you. And just, this is a group, of course, that needs to exist. And then that user should be in that group. So that way you don't have to add a whole bunch of individual accounts into the file. You just add one group, but then you have accounts being added into that group. So then here you'll follow the instructions, then add your deny SSH user to the group deny SSH. And then finally, and this is the command for that. And then once you've done that, maybe restart the SSH service. And when I say here, use PuTTY to test if it works, I just mean from your Windows machine. Remember that your Windows physical machine can be connected to your VM. So if you guys do that, you can have from the Windows machine, you can create, you can open up PuTTY and then PuTTY into the VM and test it that way. Okay. Does this make sense, guys? The idea here with this? Okay, great. All right, and then the last part of this will be just one problem, one scripting problem. So I'll kind of walk you through how you can probably do it. So basically it says, now you can disregard this part, the write a bash. Yeah, this one, we're going to skip that. You can use PuTTY to test the account, as I said, and log into the system. You can write a Python script to create one account. These are just practice things, but really this is the problem, okay? Problem 5, and I may just update this file and just leave that in there. I was just doing like practice, but basically you only have one coding problem this week, and that is, you know, let's go through it, right? So let's think about it. So assume you are a system administrator for a high school. You're having a seminar over the weekend for 30 students. You need to create user accounts for all students on your Linux Ubuntu server. Since you're very busy, you would like to automate this task. All right, so assume you have a text file containing the list of all 30 accounts. Okay, so now using Python, write a script that can read the users from a text file and create the accounts. Include your script and evidence that the script worked. Okay, so that's basically the example that we're going to do. So I'll walk you through this in a second. Let me actually just, I'm going to modify this file a little bit. Here. Okay, so the file is this one. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen here. Okay. All right, so that's just wanted to change that. And then here, I'm going to take these out. Right, and just going to say here, just Python, using Python. Yeah. So that should be enough. That should clean up the file. Everything else was good. Now let's go back to Brightspace. Okay, I'm going to delete the old one. And now I'm going to add it. Add file. All right, so that should, let me just confirm. Okay, so you can see this is the updated file and just basically has that one problem. Okay, it has that one problem. All right, so now let's go to the virtual machine. I think I start it up. Just kind of walk you through some of the commands, and like I said, it should be pretty straightforward. So I'm going to share the screen. All right, here we are. So remember, whenever you see the account user in this document, you should use seed, okay? Don't get confused by that. Okay, so let's log in. All right, so we're going to log in here. All right. So yeah, so all right. So are you guys seeing the VM? Yeah. You should be seeing the VM. So I'll kind of walk you through just briefly. This lab should be pretty easy and straightforward. But it's actually a really important lab. Remember that at the end of the semester, you'll have a project that implements several things. And one of them might be to create accounts, groups, that kind of thing. I'm still thinking about the project, but it'll be a type of project like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and navigate. So ls for the desktop. Let's navigate to ITS 372. Here. All right, so I'm going to clear here. All right, so again, I'm just going to show you the commands. As you can see, sudo passwd is the first command. Okay, that you will. I don't want to like generate it, so I'm not gonna press enter. But sudo passwd is one of the commands. The other one is sudo passwd-l root to lock it, right? Play with that once you create it. Another thing that's suggested in the lab is that you should go and visualize the Pseudoers file. So you should visualize the Pseudoers file. So I'm just going to do cat here in the etc folder. The file is Pseudoers. Okay, so it doesn't want to let you do it. Sudo. Right, and then you can see the file now with all the information, all the pertinent information. So remember that everything is a file in Linux, even configuration files. Okay, so even configuration files are mainly or configuration files or text files, so they just have all the information on here. Okay, so it talks about root, etc. And you should read it carefully, right? So you should read the file carefully and get familiar. The point is to get familiar with Linux as much as possible, honestly. So practice these things. And then there's, as I said, the two commands, add user. That's one, okay? Or the flip one, user add. So you'll have to explore the differences between these two. I suggest you kind of read through, okay? It shows you how to add a user. So sudo add user. And then, you know, let's say dummy1, right? Whatever you want it to be. Distinctive, it's fine. The command for deleting a user is sudo del user. And then dummy1, obviously something that already exists. Okay. Okay, and so on. So you can go through all the other commands. I'll just point out a few important things. Okay. So if we go to etc, okay, so we are now there, pwd ls-l, and there's nothing there. Oh, so let's look at the global user configuration file. So let's get out of here. And let's try in here cat add user dot configuration file, and there you can see the file that the document is talking about. So in this file, you can specify a few parameters for the configuration. Okay, you can see this is the SKEL reference. So this should be the file, hopefully, that you need to do the exercise. And again, as I said, this file basically has generic, or it's called a global, the global default permissions user file, I guess. And there you can see the parameter dir mode, etc., and changes. All right, I think everything else should be pretty straightforward. For those of you that are not familiar with SSH is this command, SSH, literally. It is a type of telnet, but it's a encrypted telnet. So it's a tunnel that allows you, that provides for remote basically management of systems, right? So you can use this to remote into other machines, and then you can configure the machine. So this is actually very handy. So if I do here sudo netstat -na pipe prep TCP, right? You can see the ports that are open. It's listening. One of the ports that's open is port 22. That's the port for SSH. So you should be able to connect. So for instance, if I do SSH 127.0.0.1, that's my local host. And I'm basically connecting to my own computer. So then these, and if you look, I have literally remoted into my own machine. But you can do this from a second VM. And I would recommend that as part, although it's not part of this lab, but it will be part of future labs, I would recommend just go ahead and create, as I said, a second VM in VirtualBox. Just make a copy of seed, and then they'll have different IPs. They can be on the NAT network. Just make sure they have different IPs. Make sure that you know those IPs. You know, obviously you should know if config by now, right? That gives you, usually the interface in question is ENP0S3, and you can see the network is 10.0.2.15 with a subnet mask of 255.255.0. So then basically you create another VM, it'll probably have like 10.0.2.16, let's say. And now from the two machines, just via the IP, you should be able to connect, etc. So definitely try out ping, right? And then also try out SSH. And, you know, and for this lab, you can really just SSH from one machine to the other. Any questions about that, guys? Any questions? Does that make sense? Is it clear enough? All right, great. It seems like you guys get it. Yeah, so that's really all that is kind of there. And then the last part, as I said, is just a scripting problem. And this one is super easy, actually. But I'll walk you through a little bit of it. As you know, this is with subprocess, would probably be a good approach. So I'm going to navigate to the desktop here. There, LS. ITS 372. Oh. Okay. And so in that last problem, it just says create a script that would generate automatically 30 accounts. So we're going to do nano, and I'm just going to say add 30 accounts, for instance, .py. So I'm not going to complete the whole thing, but I'm walking you through the most of it. So the trick is basically to so you're going to need to use a couple of libraries. So this is in Python, import OS, import subprocess, obviously, which is something that we've been using. And then basically now set up a password. And the password is, let's say Da Vinci, right? Or something like that. Now you may or may not need to encrypt, but we've already tried out the an encryption scheme this semester, right, with the function crypt. So I think we did a script about that. So we can do crypt, and then password, right? And I think we had to give it some kind of a hash. So just give it, you know, some parameter. Now create a user, and we can call the user the same name, you know, Da Vinci. And then now that you have those parameters, really the last part of it is just to call the function. So we're going to call subprocess dot call. And then in here, you have the parameters. So we're going to say either add user or user add. You'll have to experiment with that. But let's say user add as an example. User add, then a few flags. So the flag that you can specify is the password -p, comma. Then you can pass the encoded password. So it's going to be enc pass. And then the user, of course, right? So this should do it, except that this only does it for one, right? This only does it for one. So what do you need? You need some kind of a for loop that it reads from a file and then it generates all the accounts. This should be the logic. I mean, obviously, I want you guys to try, try finishing up the code, but this should be the general logic for this problem. Does this make sense, guys? Are there any questions about it? Yeah, so as I said, this week is actually, since it's an exam type week, the lab is pretty easy, I think. There's only this script and basically going through the lab, but it should give you enough, I think, of the information that you need to understand how accounts work and basically to have that tool set for when we have a more complicated lab later in the semester. All right, are there any questions? So that's basically kind of the overview of the lab, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and save this one, okay? So I'm going to clear this. So now, basically, I'm just going to go ahead and stop the recording. That's all the material to complete the lab. I will create, I guess, the link before I forget. So let's go back to Brightspace. So account management, right? And then under here, I'm going to create the new assignment link. And so it's going to be homework, user, account, management. So this is 100 points. This is going to be due on the 24th by 10 p.m. It opens today, and then it'll stay open until the 26th, Saturday. Complete the attached user account management Word document. And you have to complete the whole thing, as we just went over it. Yeah. And then on Tuesday, as I said, we will go over a little bit more of the theory of this, just briefly. This is an easy topic. And then after that, we'll probably get into the DNS lab, which should be a lot of fun and a little bit more complex. Okay, so here you can see your link has been created and everything. So I'll stop the recording at this time, and for the rest of the lab, just work on the assignment. I'll be here if you have any questions. Just let me know. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.